What if the most important transaction of the day wasn't happening on Wall Street, but in a greasy spoon diner over a single cup of coffee? For 3 years, a man worth billions of dollars handed a struggling waitress a $10 bill for a $3 coffee and said the same 4 words, "Keep the change, please." She thought he was just another eccentric rich man. She was wrong. The truth behind his simple, unbreakable routine was a story of unimaginable love and devastating loss, a secret that would shatter her perception of wealth and ultimately change the course of her life forever. The bell above the door of The Daily Grind was the soundtrack to Clara Jensen's life. It was a cheap, tinny jingle that announced every rushed businessman, every pair of gossiping seniors, and every bleary-eyed student seeking caffeine. For Clara, it was the sound of rent money, tuition payments, and the ever-present, low-grade hum of exhaustion. At precisely 7:05 a.m., 5 days a week, the bell would jingle with a particular quietness. It was him. He was a man who seemed to defy description. He looked to be in his late 60s, with a face that held the deep-set lines of someone who had seen too much but spoken too little. His silver hair was always neatly combed, his posture ramrod straight, even when seated. He wore simple dark suits of an obviously expensive cut, the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle or shout its worth. He was a ghost of quiet elegance in a diner that smelled perpetually of bacon grease and burnt coffee. Clara had named him Mr. Black Coffee. For the 8 to 18 days she had worked the morning shift, his order had never wavered. "Just a black coffee, please." He always sat at the same booth, table 4. It was a lumpy, cracked vinyl booth tucked into a corner, offering a clear view of the street outside, but shrouding its occupant in relative privacy. He would place a folded newspaper on the table, always the Financial Times, but he rarely read it. His gaze would fix on the window, on the flow of pedestrians and traffic, but his eyes seemed to be watching a different city, a different time. The ritual was as unchanging as the sunrise. Clara would bring the thick, white ceramic mug, the steam rising from the dark liquid. He would not, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. He would never drink it immediately. He'd just let it sit, its heat warming his hands as he cupped them around the mug. He would stay for exactly 15 minutes. Then he would stand, place a crisp $10 bill on the table, and say the only other words he ever spoke to her. "Keep the change, please." Then he would be gone, leaving behind a nearly full cup of cold coffee and a $6.50 tip. To the other staff, he was a running joke. "Old Man 10 Spot is here," Brenda, the veteran waitress with a cigarette-raspy voice, would announce from behind the counter. "Must be nice to have so much money you can throw it away on coffee you don't even drink." Sal, the cook, would lean out from the kitchen window, wiping his hands on his stained apron. "I'm telling you, he's a retired mobster. Laying low. That's his 'I'm still here' signal to his crew." Clara never joined in. She felt a strange, protective curiosity about him. She saw not eccentricity, but a profound, almost crushing loneliness. It was in the way his shoulders held a certain tension, the way his eyes, a surprisingly pale blue, seemed to hold a permanent storm cloud of grief. She saw the minute tremor in his hand as he reached for the mug, a tremor that vanished as soon as his skin touched the warm ceramic. For Clara, his generous tip was a lifeline. That extra $30.50 a week was her textbook fund, her emergency grocery money, the difference between making rent and facing her landlord's scowl. Her life was a tightrope walk of finances. A full-time nursing student at the city college, she worked 30 hours a week at the diner, her days a blur of medical terminology and customers' orders. Her younger brother, Finn, was her primary motivation. Finn had been born with a congenital heart defect, and while a childhood surgery had saved him, he would need another, more complex procedure soon. Their parents had passed away years ago, leaving Clara as his sole guardian and provider. The weight of his future rested squarely on her tired shoulders. So, Mr. Black Coffee's daily ritual was more than just a curiosity. It was a small, consistent miracle in her precarious world. Yet the mystery of it gnawed at her. Why this diner? It wasn't charming or historic. The coffee was passable, but certainly not the best in the city. A man who wore suits that cost more than her semester's tuition could have his coffee anywhere. He could have a personal barista grind beans from a remote mountaintop. Yet, he chose the daily grind. He chose table 4. He chose 1 cup of black coffee he never drank. One Tuesday morning in early April, the routine felt different. A cold, persistent rain lashed against the diner's windows, turning the street into a watercolor of blurred headlights. He arrived at 7:05 a.m., as always, but his usual stoicism was fractured. His face was paler, the lines around his eyes deeper, as if etched by a sleepless night. He didn't even bring his newspaper. He sat down, and Clara brought his coffee. "Just a black coffee, please," she said softly, placing it on the table. He didn't nod this time. He just stared at the cup, his jaw tight. For the first time, Clara saw something other than sadness in his eyes. It was raw, undiluted pain. He stayed for his usual 15 minutes, his hands wrapped around the mug, his knuckles white. When he stood to leave, his movements were stiff. He placed the $10 bill on the table. "Keep the change, please." His voice was hoarse, strained. As he turned, a small, worn object slipped from his suit pocket and fell silently onto the vinyl seat of the booth. He didn't notice. The bell jingled his departure, and he was gone, swallowed by the grey, rainy morning. Clara went to clear the table, her heart thumping with an unexplainable anxiety. The cold coffee, the $10 bill, and there, on the red cracked seat, was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. It was closed, but she could feel the faint outline of a clasp. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. It was warm from his body heat. Her first instinct was to run after him, but he was already gone. Brenda was watching her from the counter. "Finders keepers," Brenda said with a smirk. "Probably worth a pretty penny." Clara ignored her. She closed her hand around the locket, its metallic edges pressing into her palm. This was more than a lost item. She felt, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was holding a piece of the man's soul. And the mystery of Mr. Black Coffee had just become profoundly personal. The silver locket felt like a tiny, heavy secret in Clara's apron pocket all day. Every time her hand brushed against it, a jolt of nervous energy shot through her. It was an intensely private object, and holding it felt like a violation. Brenda had pestered her about it during their lunch break. "Come on, open it. I bet it's some old flame. A real black and white picture of a dame in a flapper dress." "It's not my business to open it," Clara had insisted, her voice sharper than she intended. She couldn't explain why, but the idea of prying felt like sacrilege. This man's grief, whatever its source, was a quiet, dignified thing. To force open a symbol of it seemed monstrous. That night, back in her cramped studio apartment, the locket sat on her nightstand, catching the dim glow of her bedside lamp. The rain had stopped, but the city outside was still slick and dark. She stared at it while studying a chapter on cardiovascular pharmacology, the complex diagrams of the human heart blurring into the simple, heart-shaped piece of silver. Finn's heart. The locket. Everything felt connected by a thread of fragility. Her resolve finally crumbled around 2 a.m., fueled by caffeine and exhaustion. She told herself it was practical. If she knew what was inside, it might help her understand its importance to him, reinforce her determination to return it. It was a flimsy excuse, and she knew it. Her curiosity had become an unbearable weight. With trembling fingers, she found the tiny clasp. It was stiff, and it took a few tries before it sprung open with a soft click. It wasn't one photograph, but two, tucked into the delicate oval frames. They were faded, the colors muted by time. On the left side was a woman. She was beautiful, not in a glamorous movie star way, but with a warmth that seemed to radiate from the glossy paper. She had kind, laughing eyes and a spray of freckles across her nose. Her dark hair was caught in the wind, and she was looking at someone just out of frame with an expression of pure, unadulterated love. On the right side was a young boy, no older than 7 or 8. He had the same pale blue eyes as Mr. Black Coffee, but they were bright with childhood mischief, not clouded with sorrow. He had a gap-toothed grin and a shock of sandy brown hair that fell over his forehead. He was wearing a small baseball cap, slightly askew, and holding up a drawing of a lopsided, smiling sun. Clara's breath caught in her throat. A wife and a son. A family. The man who sat alone in a diner, staring at nothing, had once been the center of this vibrant, happy world. She snapped the locket shut, a hot flush of shame washing over her. She had trespassed. This wasn't a story. It was a life that had clearly been fractured. The next morning, she arrived at the diner an hour early, her nerves a tangled mess. She polished the cutlery with a ferocity that drew a raised eyebrow from Sal. She kept the locket in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the conversation to come. How would she even approach him? He was a man of fewer than 10 words a day. What if he was angry she had found it? What if he was embarrassed? At 7:05 a.m., the bell jingled. He walked in, his face a mask of impenetrable calm, the previous day's raw pain tucked away. He sat at table 4 and waited. Clara took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She poured his coffee, her hand shaking so much that a small amount sloshed onto the saucer. She walked over, her steps feeling heavy and loud in the quiet diner. "Your coffee," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the window. He hadn't noticed her distress. She stood there for a moment, frozen, losing her nerve. This was a mistake. She should just leave it on the table with a note after he was gone. But then she thought of the laughing woman and the gap-toothed boy. They deserved more than an anonymous return. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice cracking slightly. He turned his head slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were clear, focused, and utterly devoid of expression. For a second, she felt like an insect under a microscope. I think you might have dropped this yesterday." She pulled the locket from her pocket and held it out on her open palm. It looked small and fragile against her skin. His reaction was instantaneous and profound. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. His eyes widened, a flicker of panic in them. His hand, the one that always had a slight tremor, shot out and snatched the locket from her palm with a surprising swiftness. His fingers closed around it, a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound in the quiet diner. He didn't speak for a full minute. He just stared at the locket in his fist, his knuckles white. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Clara felt her face burn, certain she had overstepped, that she had caused him pain. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." "Thank you," he interrupted. His voice was a low, rough rasp, thick with an emotion he was struggling to contain. He cleared his throat and looked up at her. The impenetrable wall was gone. For the first time, she saw the man, not the enigma. She saw a man drowning in a sea of memory. "It is very important to me," he added, his gaze dropping back to the locket. "I can imagine," she said softly. He slipped the locket back into his pocket, his hand lingering there, as if to make sure it was safe. He then looked back at the coffee, at the window, and then, surprisingly, back at her. "Thank you," he said again, and this time there was a hint of warmth in his tone. "Thank you. What is your name?" The question stunned her. In over 2 years, he had never asked. "It's Clara. Clara Jensen." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Clara." He tested the name on his tongue, as if committing it to memory. "Thank you." That was all. He turned back to the window, the conversation over, but the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. A bridge had been crossed. He stayed for his usual 15 minutes, though today he seemed to see the street outside, not the ghosts. When he left, he placed the $10 bill on the table. "Keep the change, please, Clara." The use of her name was as startling as a shout in a library. As she picked up the bill, her hand brushed against the still warm mug. The coffee inside was, as always, untouched. But today, it felt different. It no longer felt like a waste. It felt like an offering. The dynamic between them shifted after the locket incident. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but it was there. He still ordered only a black coffee. He still stayed for only 15 minutes. But the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a quiet acknowledgement. He started looking at her when she brought his coffee, his pale blue eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. A silent "good morning" passed between them. He began leaving a $20 bill instead of a 10. The first time it happened, Clara tried to object. "Sir, this is too much." "A token of my gratitude," he'd said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "For your honesty." The extra money was a godsend. It went directly into the Finn's Future Fund, a small savings account she meticulously fed with every spare dollar. The surgeon had given them a 6-month timeline, a window to prepare for the pre-op consultations and the cascade of expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. The extra tips eased a fraction of the immense pressure on her chest. Clara's curiosity, however, had been stoked into a burning fire. The man had a name for her now. She needed one for him. The answer came from an unexpected source: his newspaper. One morning, about a month after she returned the locket, he was more distracted than usual. He actually opened his copy of the Financial Times and was scanning an article, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he left, he accidentally left the paper behind, folded open to a page in the business section. Clara snatched it up before Brenda could toss it. The article was about a multi-billion-dollar merger in the tech industry. A smaller, innovative robotics firm was being acquired by a giant corporation. The article featured a file photo of the reclusive founder and CEO of the smaller firm, who had just netted an estimated $2.8 billion from the deal. The photo was grainy and clearly taken years ago, but it was unmistakably him. His hair was darker, his face less lined, but the piercing blue eyes and the rigid posture were the same. The name beneath the photo made her stomach clench. Arthur Vance, founder of Vance Robotics. Clara stumbled back, leaning against the counter for support. She felt dizzy, as if the diner floor had tilted beneath her feet. Mr. Black coffee. Old man 10 spot. The quiet, sad man in the corner booth was Arthur Vance, a titan of industry, a certified billionaire. She spent her entire break in the diner's small, stuffy office, hunched over the ancient desktop computer. The internet confirmed it in stark, unbelievable detail. Arthur Vance was a legend in the tech world, known for his brilliant, near-prophetic innovations in artificial intelligence and automation. He was also notoriously private, having retreated from public life over a decade ago following a personal tragedy. Article after article painted a picture of a man who had everything and nothing. He had built an empire from the ground up, but his personal life was a fortress. Most biographies mentioned his wife, Eleanor Vance, a celebrated botanist who had passed away 12 years ago from a brief illness. They mentioned the charitable foundation he established in her name, the Eleanor Vance Foundation, which funded children's hospitals and botanical gardens. But there was almost no mention of a son. Clara had to dig through obscure social archives and old society pages to find a single, brief mention from over 20 years ago. Arthur and Eleanor Vance welcomed their first child. A son, Leo. After that, nothing. Leo Vance was a ghost. Clara leaned back in the creaky office chair, her mind reeling. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was a mosaic of heartbreaking fragments. A billionaire, a dead wife, a vanished son, and a daily, 15-minute pilgrimage to a dingy diner. The knowledge changed everything. His simple suit was no longer just a suit. It was a bespoke creation that probably cost more than her car. His quiet demeanor wasn't just shyness, it was the practiced reserve of a man accustomed to immense power. His generosity wasn't just a kind gesture. The $20 he left her was, to him, less than a speck of dust. The revelation also filled her with a profound sense of unease. Why would a man like Arthur Vance come here? With his resources, he could have the memory of this place recreated in his mansion if he wanted. There had to be something more. Something about the physical space of Table 4, about the ritual itself, that he needed. The next day, when he came in, she couldn't look at him the same way. She saw the weight of his fortune, the shadow of his empire, the ghosts of the names she'd read online. She felt a new distance between them, a chasm of wealth and status that she hadn't perceived before. He seemed to sense her unease. "Is everything all right, Clara?" he asked, his voice low. It was the first time he had ever initiated a conversation. "Yes, fine," she lied, her voice tight. "Just a long night of studying." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on her for a second longer than usual, a flicker of something she couldn't decipher, concern, curiosity, in their depths. That week, the news about Finn came, a call from Dr. Miller's office. Finn's latest scans showed that his condition was deteriorating faster than they'd anticipated. They needed to move the surgery up. Not in 6 months, in 6 weeks. The world tilted again, this time far more violently. The estimated cost for the out-of-pocket expenses, travel and recovery support was nearly $50,000. The Finn's Future Fund held just over $6,000. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Clara. For the first time in her life, she felt truly hopeless. She went through the motions at the diner, her smile a brittle facade, her mind a frantic storm of calculations and dead ends. Selling the car wouldn't be enough. A second loan was impossible. The next morning, Arthur Vance walked in. He sat at table 4 and waited for his coffee. As Clara approached him, a new, terrible thought crept into her mind. The man sitting in that booth, nursing a coffee he would never drink, could solve her problem with the financial equivalent of a rounding error. He could save her brother's life and not even notice the money was gone. The thought was ugly and opportunistic, and she hated herself for it. This man was her customer, not her savior. He was a grieving man who had shown her a sliver of kindness. But the desperation was a physical thing, clawing at her throat. She placed his coffee on the table, her hand trembling violently. This time she couldn't hide it. "Clara," Arthur Vance said, his voice cutting through her panic. "You are not all right. Tell me what's wrong." It wasn't a question. It was a gentle command. And looking into the eyes of the billionaire in the booth, Clara felt her carefully constructed walls of composure begin to crumble. The dam of Clara's composure broke not with a flood, but with a single, traitorous tear that escaped and slid down her cheek. She hastily wiped it away with the back of her hand, mortified. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice choked. She had never used his name before. The sound of it hung in the air between them, a confirmation that she knew who he was. His expression didn't change, but a subtle understanding dawned in his eyes. He wasn't surprised or angry that she knew his identity. He simply absorbed the fact and moved on. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the opposite side of the booth. "I can't, I'm working," she protested weakly, the diner's rules a flimsy shield against the intensity of his gaze. "Sit down, Clara." His tone was soft, yet it held the unmistakable authority of a man who was rarely disobeyed. She slid into the booth, her apron crinkling against the vinyl. She felt the eyes of Brenda and the other morning regulars on her. It was a bizarre tableau, the reclusive billionaire and the weeping waitress huddled together at table 4. "Tell me," he said simply. And so it all spilled out. The words tumbled out of her in a hushed, frantic torrent. About Finn, his congenital heart defect, the first surgery, the years of careful monitoring. She told him about the sudden turn, the accelerated timeline, the staggering cost that felt like an insurmountable mountain. She told him about being alone, about the crushing weight of being the only person Finn had in the world. She cried not for pity, but from the sheer exhaustion of carrying the burden alone for so long. Throughout her confession, Arthur Vance just listened. He didn't offer platitudes or interruptions. He simply watched her, his full attention focused on her, his pale blue eyes reflecting her own pain. In his stillness, she found a strange comfort. It felt as if he was shouldering some of her despair just by hearing it. When she finally fell silent, her story told, she felt empty and exposed, her cheeks flushed with shame. "I'm so sorry to unload all of that on you. It's not your problem." "My wife was a botanist," he said, the apparent non sequitur catching her completely off guard. "Eleanor. She believed that some plants, like the sequoia, can only release their seeds in the intense heat of a forest fire. She said that sometimes it takes a catastrophe for new life to begin." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window. "Grief is a catastrophe, Clara. So is fear for someone you love. It burns away everything non-essential and shows you what truly matters." He then looked directly at her. "The hospital. Which one is it?" "St. Jude's Children's Hospital," she replied, her voice still shaky. "The cardiac unit is one of the best in the country." At the mention of the name, a shadow passed over Arthur's face. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, a flicker of profound pain in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had the day he dropped the locket. "St. Jude's," he repeated, the name a ghost on his lips. He seemed to retreat into himself for a moment, the diner and Clara fading away, replaced by a memory only he could see. "Mr. Vance?" she asked hesitantly. He blinked, returning to the present. "I know the chief of cardiac surgery there," he said, his voice now crisp and businesslike, the vulnerable moment gone. "Dr. Alistair Finch, a brilliant man." He pulled a sleek, minimalist phone from his pocket and a pen from his jacket. "What is your brother's full name and his doctor's?" Clara gave him the information, her mind struggling to keep up. The speed of the transition from empathetic listener to man of action was jarring. He wrote down the details on a napkin with neat, precise handwriting. "I will make a call," he said, tucking the napkin and his phone away. "The foundation my wife started, the Eleanor Vance Foundation, is a primary benefactor for St. Jude's. We can expedite things, ensure he gets the absolute best care. The cost will be handled." Clara stared at him, speechless. It couldn't be that simple. Her years of frantic saving, her sleepless nights, the terror that had been her constant companion, all of it erased in a matter of seconds with a promise of a phone call. I can't ask you to do that," she stammered, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "I can't possibly repay you." "There is nothing to repay," he said, a note of finality in his voice. "Consider it a return for an act of honesty. The locket is worth more to me than this." He waved a hand, dismissing the $50,000 as if it were pocket change, which, for him, it was. He stood up, his 15 minutes long over. But today he didn't leave immediately. He looked down at her, and his expression softened. "You are a good sister, Clara. Your brother is lucky to have you." He placed a $20 bill on the table, a force of habit. "Keep the change, please," he said, and for the first time the words were accompanied by the faintest hint of a smile. He walked out, the bell jingling his exit. Clara remained in the booth, her body trembling with a mixture of shock, relief, and a dizzying sense of disbelief. Sal came out from the kitchen. "Everything okay, kid?" he asked, his usual gruffness tinged with concern. "I think so, Sal," she said, looking at the napkin with Arthur's handwriting that he'd left behind. "I think everything is going to be okay." But as the initial wave of euphoria subsided, a chilling question lingered. Why did the name St. Jude's affect him so deeply? Her brother's hospital, the place of her potential salvation, was clearly, for Arthur Vance, a place of profound and terrible significance. She had a feeling their stories were connected by more than just a diner booth, and that the full truth behind his morning ritual was far darker than she had ever imagined. The next 2 days were a blur of surreal efficiency. On Thursday, Clara received a call from a woman with a calm, professional voice, introducing herself as Evelyn Reed, the executive director of the Eleanor Vance Foundation. Ms. Reed informed her that an anonymous grant had been established to cover all of Finn Jensen's medical and associated costs for his upcoming surgery at St. Jude's. The paperwork would be handled. All Clara needed to do was focus on her brother. Clara sat on her lumpy sofa, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to the impossible words. An anonymous grant. She knew it was Arthur, of course, but his insistence on privacy was absolute. He was a ghost in this too, a benevolent force who moved mountains from the shadows. On Friday morning, Arthur did not come to the diner. His absence was a gaping hole in the fabric of the morning. Table 4 sat empty, clean, and silent. 7:05 came and went. Then 7:15, then 7:30. Clara found herself watching the door, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Had she scared him off by sharing her problems? Had she broken the unspoken rules of their quiet arrangement? Brenda, naturally, had a theory. "See, I told you. He gets a sob story from the waitress, throws some chump change her way, and now he doesn't have to show his face again. Rich guys hate being put on the spot." Clara ignored her, but the words stung because they echoed her own fears. He didn't come on Monday either. Or Tuesday. By Wednesday, a week after their conversation, Clara had moved from anxiety to genuine worry. Her relief about Finn's surgery was now tangled with a growing concern for the man who had made it possible. The ritual wasn't just his, It had become hers too. His 15 minutes of silent vigil had become a fixed point in her chaotic days. Without it, the morning felt unmoored. She thought about the look on his face when she'd mentioned St. Jude's. It wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, a visceral reaction to a placed name, a place he was now sending her and her brother. That afternoon, she made a decision. Taking a bus to the city's affluent west side, she found the address for the Eleanor Vance Foundation. It was a discreet, elegant brownstone, marked only by a small brass plaque. Taking a deep breath, she went inside. The interior was hushed and tasteful, more art gallery than office. The woman at the front desk was polite but firm. Mr. Vance was not available. Mr. Vance did not take unscheduled appointments. "I'm not here to see him," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here to see Ms. Reed. It's about the Clara Jensen grant." That got her through the door. Evelyn Reed was the woman from the phone, her calm voice matched by a poised and graceful presence. She was in her late 50s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything before it was said. She led Clara to a comfortable office overlooking a small, serene garden. "Clara," she said warmly, "it's a pleasure to meet you in person. Is there an issue with the arrangements for your brother?" "No, not at all. Everything is... It's more than I could have ever dreamed of." "That's why I'm here," Clara began, fumbling with her words. "I came to say thank you, and to ask about Mr. Vance. He hasn't been to the diner all week. I'm worried something is wrong." Evelyn's professional smile softened into something more genuine, tinged with melancholy. Arthur is a man of routines. When they are broken, it is usually for a significant reason. This week is always difficult for him." She gestured for Clara to sit. "I feel you deserve to know a part of the story, Clara. Not the whole thing. That is Arthur's to tell. But you should understand the context of his gift." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. 25 years ago, Arthur and his wife, Eleanor, were the happiest people I had ever known. Their son, Leo, was their entire world. He was a bright, funny, wonderful little boy. Clara's heart began to beat faster. Leo, the boy from the locket. When Leo was 7, Evelyn continued, her gaze distant. He was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of leukemia. They threw everything they had at it. The best doctors, the best treatments. Their lives became a cycle of hospital visits, chemotherapy, and desperate hope. And their primary treatment center was St. Jude's Children's Hospital. The air left Clara's lungs. The connection was as brutal and direct as a physical blow. "But the diner," Clara whispered. "Why the diner?" "Hope," Evelyn said simply. The daily grind is 2 blocks from St. Jude's. Every single morning, before heading to the hospital for another day of treatments and terrifying uncertainty, Arthur and Eleanor would stop at your diner. They would sit in that same booth, table 4, and have 1 cup of coffee together. They didn't have an appetite for anything else. For 15 minutes, they weren't the terrified parents of a sick child. They were just a couple, holding hands over a warm mug, gathering the strength to face the day. It was their sanctuary, their ritual of hope. Evelyn paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Leo fought for almost a year. He was incredibly brave, but the illness was too aggressive. He passed away on a Tuesday in April, 21 years ago this week. Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The rainy Tuesday, the day Arthur had dropped the locket, the anniversary. He hadn't just been having a bad day. He had been reliving the worst day of his life. Eleanor was never the same, Evelyn said softly. She poured her energy into philanthropy, into building this foundation to help other children, other families. But a part of her died with Leo. Her brief illness 12 years ago was, as Arthur calls it, a broken heart that finally gave out. So Arthur continues the ritual. Every morning, he goes to the diner to have coffee with his wife and son, to sit in the place where, for a few minutes each day, hope felt real. He doesn't drink the coffee because he is not there for the coffee. He is there for the memory. He is there to feel close to them, to start his day with the two people he lost. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, silent and hot. The mystery of Mr. Black coffee was solved, and the truth was 1,000 times more devastating than anything she could have imagined. His ritual wasn't an eccentricity. It was an act of unwavering love and devotion. The $10 bill wasn't a tip. It was an offering to the ghosts of his past. "Your story, Clara," Evelyn finished gently. "Your fierce love for your brother. Your fight to save him at the very hospital where Arthur lost his son. It must have resonated with him on a level none of us can understand. He isn't just helping you. I believe, in some way, he feels like he's getting a second chance to fight for a child at St. Jude's. By saving Finn, he is honoring Leo." Clara left the foundation in a daze. The city streets seemed muted, the noise of the traffic fading into a dull roar. She now understood everything: his solitude, his generosity, his pain. The weight of his gift felt immense, forged not just from his wealth, but from the ashes of his own personal tragedy. He had given her hope in the very place his own had died. The following morning, Clara walked into the daily grind with a heavy heart. The diner felt different, each detail now imbued with a new, poignant significance. The cracked vinyl of Table 4 wasn't just old, it was a silent witness. The smell of coffee wasn't just a smell, it was the aroma of a family's last bastion of normalcy. She didn't know if he would come. After the anniversary, after Evelyn's revelation, she couldn't guess what he would do. But at 7:05 a.m. the bell jingled. Arthur Vance walked in. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes thinner, more fragile. The past week had clearly taken its toll. He moved to Table 4 and sat down, his posture as straight as ever. But there was a new vulnerability in his stillness. Clara took a deep breath. She poured his coffee, her hand steady now. She walked to his table and placed the mug gently in front of him. "Good morning, Arthur," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. He looked up, and his eyes held no surprise, only a deep, weary acceptance. He knew that she knew. Perhaps Evelyn had told him about her visit. Perhaps he could just see it in her face. "Good morning, Clara," he replied, his voice a low rasp. She didn't retreat to the counter this time. She remained standing by the table. "Can I join you? Just for a minute?" He nodded, a simple, tired gesture. She slid into the seat opposite him. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the quiet hum of the diner swirling around them. The unspoken truth of his past lay on the table between them, as tangible as the steam rising from the coffee. "Evelyn told me you stopped by the foundation," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the mug. "She is a wonderful woman, but she worries too much." "She told me about Leo," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "And Eleanor, and about this place." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing his features. When he opened them, he seemed to have made a decision. The walls of his reserve, already fractured, finally came down. "Every detail of it is burned into my mind," he began, his voice low and steady, as if he were reciting a sacred text. "Eleanor would always sit where you are sitting. She'd complain that the coffee was too bitter. but she'd drink it anyway. She said it was honest coffee, no frills. She liked that. He looked out the window, but Clara knew he was seeing the street as it was 21 years ago. Leo loved the bell on the door. He called it the diner ding. He'd be on his way to St. Jude's for another round of procedures. Some days he was so weak he could barely walk, but he'd hear that bell and a little smile would light up his face. For a few seconds he was just a kid excited to be out, not a patient. Clara could picture it perfectly. The laughing woman from the locket, the brave boy with his father's eyes, and the younger, unburdened Arthur Vance, all squeezed into this booth. This was our 15 minutes of peace, he continued, his hands cupping the mug, just as she had seen him do 1,000 times. But now she understood. He wasn't warming his hands, he was holding his wife's. In the hospital, we were defined by the illness. We were Leo's parents. The doctors would talk in acronyms and percentages. Hope was a clinical trial. Fear was a set of numbers on a chart. But in here, we were just a family. We would talk about baseball, about Eleanor's plans for her garden, about what superpower Leo would choose. He always chose invisibility, so he could sneak into the kitchen and steal cookies. A tear traced a path through the lines on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. The day he died was a Tuesday. It was raining. We came here just like always. He'd had a terrible night, and he was sleeping in his room at the hospital. We almost didn't come, but Eleanor insisted. She said, "We can't let the fear win. We need our coffee." So we sat here, in this booth, and we held hands, and we prayed. We talked about a future where he was healthy, where we could take him to the Grand Canyon. We were buying time, you see. Buying hope in 15-minute increments. He finally looked at Clara, his pale blue eyes swimming with a grief so profound it was almost breathtaking. We finished our coffee and went back to the hospital. And he was gone. He had slipped away in his sleep. We missed it. We missed his last moments because we were here, drinking coffee. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The guilt he must have carried for 2 decades. It was unthinkable. "Arthur," Clara whispered, her own tears flowing freely now. "It's not your fault. You were gathering the strength you needed for him. You were keeping the hope alive for him. That's what he would have wanted." "I know that in my head," he said, his voice breaking. "But my heart has been stuck in this booth for 21 years, waiting for them to come back." He took a shaky breath, composing himself. "When you told me about your brother, about St. Jude's, it was like a ghost walking through the door. All this time, I have been pouring money into that hospital through the foundation, but it was always from a distance, a check, a building wing. It was anonymous, safe. But your story, it made it real again. It gave me a chance to do for your family what I couldn't do for my own. To see a child walk out of that hospital, healthy and whole. This was it. The breakdown. Not a loud, dramatic collapse, but a quiet, soul-bearing catharsis." Clara reached across the table and, without thinking, placed her hand over his. His skin was cold, but he didn't pull away. He wrapped his fingers around hers, his grip surprisingly strong, anchoring himself to the present. "You're honoring him, Arthur," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're honoring Leo in the most beautiful way possible. You're giving Finn a future." For the first time since she'd met him, Arthur Vance let go completely. His shoulders slumped, and he wept. He wept for his son, for his wife, for the 21 years of lonely mornings in a diner booth. And Clara sat with him, holding his hand, her own tears falling for his loss, for her brother's future, and for the incredible, heartbreaking, beautiful human connection they had forged over a simple cup of black coffee. The diner hummed around them, but in the small bubble of table 4, 2 worlds had collided, and a quiet, profound healing had finally begun. In the weeks that followed Arthur's confession, a new ritual began to form, one built not on silent grief, but on shared humanity. Arthur still arrived at 7:05 a.m. every morning. He still sat at table 4 and ordered a black coffee. But now, Clara would bring 2 mugs. She'd pour his, then pour one for herself from the staff pot. For the first 10 minutes of his 15-minute stay, she would sit with him on her legally mandated break. They didn't always talk about the past. In fact, they rarely did. Instead, he would ask about her studies. He'd listen intently as she described the intricacies of cardiac anatomy or the frustrations of memorizing drug interactions. He had a brilliant, incisive mind, and he'd often ask questions that pushed her to think more deeply, to see the connections she'd missed in her textbooks. For the first time, her studies felt less like a chore and more like a fascinating puzzle. In return, she would ask him about his work. He'd talk about robotics and AI, not in the dry, technical terms of a CEO, but with the passion of an artist. He explained how he was designing automated systems to assist surgeons in delicate operations, to make procedures less invasive and more precise. He spoke of creating technology not to replace humans, but to augment their skill and compassion. Clara realized he wasn't just building machines. He was trying to build a world where fewer people would suffer the kind of loss he had. His work, like his philanthropy, was a tribute to Leo. Finn's surgery was a resounding success. Arthur had arranged for them to fly on a private jet, a kindness that spared Finn the exhaustion and risk of commercial travel. Clara stayed with her brother in a comfortable suite near the hospital, all expenses covered by the foundation. Dr. Finch, the surgeon Arthur knew, was a master, his hands steady and his demeanor reassuring. The day Finn was discharged, a black car was waiting for them. The driver handed Clara an envelope. Inside was not a bill, but a letter. It was from the City College nursing program. It stated that an anonymous benefactor had established a full scholarship in her name, covering her tuition, books, and living expenses until graduation. The Clara Jensen Future Healers Grant. Clara sat in the car, her sleeping brother's head resting on her shoulder, and cried tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The mountain of debt and worry that had shadowed her entire adult life had vanished. Arthur hadn't just saved her brother. He had given her back her own future. When she returned to the daily grind a week later to work her final shift, she found Arthur at table 4. She sat down opposite him, placing 2 mugs on the table. "I don't know how to thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with an emotion too vast for words. "You've changed my life. You've changed our lives." He simply smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his pale blue eyes, chasing away some of the storm clouds. "You said I was giving Finn a future. You were wrong. You both gave me one. I spent 2 decades looking backward. You, Clara, have reminded me of the importance of looking forward." He slid a small, elegantly wrapped box across the table. A graduation present. A little early, I know. Inside was a brand new, top-of-the-line stethoscope, its silver metal gleaming. Engraved on the chest piece, in small, delicate script, were the words, "For Clara. Keep listening." Clara would go on to graduate at the top of her class. She accepted a position as a pediatric cardiac nurse at St. Jude's, working alongside the very doctors who had saved her brother. She excelled, her empathy and skill making her a favorite among the young patients and their terrified parents. She understood their fear in a way no textbook could ever teach. Arthur Vance never stopped his morning ritual. But it was different now. The diner staff, even Brenda, began to see him not as an eccentric joke, but as a quiet pillar of their morning. He still ordered 1 black coffee, but he no longer left it untouched. On the anniversary of Leo's death, Clara would find him at the table, and she would sit with him, and he would tell her a new story about his son, the time Leo built a lopsided rocket in the backyard, or his terrible but enthusiastic singing voice. He was no longer just preserving a memory. He was sharing it. Sometimes, on her days off, Clara would visit the diner. She'd slide into the booth at table 4, opposite her friend, Arthur. They would sit, 2 people from impossibly different worlds, bound by a shared understanding of loss, hope, and the profound, life-altering power of a simple act of kindness. The ghost at table 4 was no longer a ghost. He was a man who had learned to live again, all thanks to a waitress who took the time to look past the money and see the man, and a daily cup of coffee that held the bitter, beautiful taste of love that never dies. This story reminds us that behind every face, there is a story we cannot see. A simple routine, an everyday gesture, can hold the weight of a person's entire world. Arthur Vance had all the money one could ever dream of, but it couldn't buy back what he had lost. What began to heal him was something far more valuable, a moment of human connection, and the empathy of a stranger who refused to see him as just a transaction. It teaches us that the greatest gifts we can give are often the ones that cost nothing: our time, our attention, and our compassion. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. What did you think of Arthur's secret? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that explore the hidden depths of the human heart. Thank you for listening.